This is the last event that's being held as part of the College of Business and Social Sciences Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Week here at Aston University. Our event, it follows a number of events, including Professor Kalman Bhopal's excellent lecture on intersectionality of race and gender in HE. And following that lecture, I'm delighted to welcome a fantastic panel of speakers to this session on as I say, on class and precarity within higher education. We're very fortunate today to be joined by Dr. Barbara Reid. Barbara is currently a reader in gender and social inequalities at the School of Education at University of Glasgow, and she specialises in higher education and the experiences of both staff and students. Also on the panel we have Laura Miles. Laura is a retired senior lecturer at in social science from Bradford College, mainly teaching on HE courses like counselling and psychology. Laura has also been a long-term trade union activist in first the College Lecturers Union and then in the University and College Union, where she was an LGBT rep on the National Executive Committee for a number of years. She remains involved in the UCU and as an activist and writer on trans issues. Her book, Transgender Resistance, Socialism and the Fight for Trans Liberation, came out around about a year ago, so please do check that out. And then finally on the panel we have Dr. Teresa Crew speaking today. Teresa is a senior lecturer in social policy at Bangor University. Teresa's research has looked at the intersection and inequalities in relation to class, gender and place. And she published a book in 2020 with Palgrave called Higher Education and Working Class Academics, Precarity and Diversity in Academia. Just at this point, can I kindly ask everyone, all the guests, to turn off their cameras and mute their mics. The format of the session is pretty straightforward. It's divided into the first half, where we'll have each of our speakers delivering a short talk of around 5 to 10 minutes, speaking to these kind of key themes and drawing on their experiences and their research. And then that'll be followed by a general question and answer session. If you do think of a question while the speakers are talking, you can post that question, write that question in the chat function, and I will collate them and ask them on your behalf at the end of the talks, or you can choose to wait to the kind of general question and answer and use the raised hand function and ask your question or address your question to one of the speakers or all of the speakers over the microphone yourself, if you prefer. So finally, just to again reiterate that today's session is recorded and it will be distributed to all attendees, and feel free to pass this on to colleagues or your wider network. So with that, I will pass over to our first speaker, Dr. Barbara Reid.
Okay, yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me, Danny, and Aston University colleagues. It's really good to be here. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So I've been doing research for a few years now on the experience of academic staff, academic working lives, and that's included the issue of social precarity and the increasing casualisation of jobs in the sector. And in doing this work, I've tended to use a particular definition of precarity or social precarity that I'll just sort of outline right at the beginning here. As I've been using it, the term relates to people's experience or feelings of insecurity or destabilization, a feeling of slipping over the edge. And I found the work of Judith Butler helpful here, who uses the term social precarity to refer to precarity that's not simply the product of an accident. So, for example, just slipping on an icy pavement, but it's a precarity or feeling of destabilization connected to or even caused by wider socio-political policies and practices. For example, being moved by your institution onto a 0 hours contract, or a tier 4 student falling foul of tightened policies around visa regulation. And social precarity in this way can obviously be experienced by a wide range of people, but it's more likely to be felt by those in less advantaged groups. And when people in less advantaged groups are in such positions, they also tend to experience it more severely because of the lesser resources that they have to be able to mitigate the effects of precarity. And it's important to obviously think about academic culture and in terms of its history of never really being a place where a sense of security was felt by all. So throughout its history, the university has been shown to be extremely hierarchical and inegalitarian at times. And the cultures and practices of university often still show their connection to the historical norm or the sort of typical notion of the academic and the student as coming from more privileged middle or upper class backgrounds, more likely to be white and very much more likely to be male until at least mid-20th century. And this idea of this sort of typical academic and student as coming from these more privileged identity positions has a knock-on effect with, for example, the in terms of cultures and practices, like assuming students don't need to juggle work or study with additional part-time jobs, for example. The idea that they are school leavers and they don't have childcare or other care commitments, and so on. The idea that you can be independent or that you're being supported by other members of your family and that you are a sort of free agent to work all hours and work with the minimum of support. And so there's been a lot of work on looking at the notion of the student, the ideal student as the independent learner, as a student that doesn't need to do to have that much support at university. Indeed, it's been seen the idea can be that there can be a deficit discourse invoked whereby if students are seen to need extra support to learn the ropes at university, it's assumed that that means that, you know, that they are somehow less authentically have the right to be there because they need this extra support, rather than you know, sort of acknowledging that some students are much more likely to have familiarity with the things that with the cultures and practices of university, perhaps because they have their own family history of people who've gone to university who can tell people about the rules of the game, or their parents may have connections with people that can help give extra support to students. Other students don't have those resources and therefore perhaps do need an extra layer of support. And the casualisation of the labour force has a direct knock-on effect in the ability for academics to be able to give support to students over and above their contracted hours. Quite a few hourly paid lecturers, for example, are not given extra time to be able to follow up student questions unless they do that in their own unpaid time. So that can have a knock-on effect on students who, as I say, don't have that the capital or of being able to sort of get through university without that extra help. And it also has a disadvantages casualised staff as well. And these things are only sort of exacerbated in the current COVID climate, whereby students from less privileged backgrounds may be dealing with a host of other forms of precarity, for example, housing precarity or debt-induced precarity as well. So all this then points to the need to make sure that we prioritise looking at the connections between class and precarity, as well as other aspects of identity, when we look at students' experience within and beyond the university. And I'll leave it there and pass over to my colleagues on the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. And if we could, I think some of those issues of casualisation and it can be picked up by our next speaker, Laura Miles.
Thanks, Danny, and thanks, Barbara, for that really interesting introduction. I'm not a researcher in this area. I suppose what I'm going to say is mostly based on kind of personal, professional background. I've been around quite a long time, as it happens, but also informed by several decades of trade union activity. Observing and attempting to intervene in the processes that have occurred in terms of making the jobs of all involved in higher and further education actually more precarious, more difficult, more stressful over the past decade. So I'm going to, it's probably a bit of a historical perspective as well here, I suppose. I spent 35 years teaching in further and higher education from 1979. The last 25 years teaching higher education social science courses in an FE college. Bit of an unusual situation there. Our students were predominantly local, living at home, working class, and around 50% Black and minority ethnic. And the majority were mature, were second chance students in most cases, often with families and sometimes with very limited formal academic backgrounds. We were strongly committed to the principle of widening participation at that time, given their class background. Even 20 years ago, many of our students were working at the same time as studying, and we developed strong pastoral care processes to address the particular pressures that they faced. The majority were, in fact, highly motivated and achieved good degree outcomes. In my early years in the 1980s in FE, around 80% of teaching was delivered by full-time teaching staff. Part-time staff tended to deliver the other 20%, often teaching, particular specialised vocational areas and modules or additional classes due to heavy demand. Wherever possible, strong union branches like the one that I was in tried to consolidate part-time hours into full-time posts, as we did when I first moved into higher education as well. And that is very difficult to keep going, frankly. Now in higher education, something like 54% of all academic staff and 49% of teaching staff are on insecure contracts, atypical contracts of one sort or another. In the Russell Group, the elite universities, it's actually even worse. It's over 58% of teaching staff. Anyway, from the early 1990s, governments have sought to drive market values into FE first, notably through incorporation. People might not be aware what that was, but it was a move by the then Tory government, which removed further education colleges from any democratic local authority control. And one consequence of that was that increasingly course viability, excuse me, and course outcomes became assessed on the basis of financial viability, cost effectiveness and employability rather than educational criteria. It's also interesting, I wanted to mention as well about the precarious contracts that people are on now. Something like 40% of hourly paid lecturers currently, this is from a survey that UCU did not that long ago, 40% earn under £1,000 per month, 1 in 7 less than £500 a month, 17% struggling to pay for food. I mean, you have lecturers using food banks in some cases, 34% struggling to pay rent and mortgage, and all the anxiety and inability to plan careers or lives that flows from that. We don't really know the full extent of this because HESA, the Higher Education Statistics Agency, actually doesn't actually doesn't collect particularly robust statistics on this, and so some of it is difficult to pin down. I'm sure anybody researching in this area would endorse that. So all of this really ran counter to the view that I'd entered teaching with, was that education should be universal, free and lifelong, and as much about the development of critical thinking and a rounded educated person as about future employability. Adult education was devastated by this process of marketisation, and the intrusion of neoliberal criteria accelerated and rapidly began to permeate higher education too. It's actually worth having a look at a couple of books and pamphlets, if you can get hold of them, that came out at the time. There's one by Alex Kalinikos, who I think was a professor at York at the time, Universities in a Neoliberal World. And there's another one, very good book by Andrew McGettigan, called The Great University Gamble. That came out in 2013. And both of these chart the process of marketisation and privatisation that has proceeded headlong, really, in higher education. Alex Kalinikos, for example, wrote that what neoliberalism has done has been to isolate and enforce a very pure form of the logic of capitalism itself. This, as we have seen in the case of universities, is a logic of competition and profit. So we saw student loans being introduced and ramped up. Competition between higher education institutions for students has grown massively, as has staff workloads, stress, mental distress and burnout. Today, many HE institutions have outsourced support services and employ non-academic staff and sometimes consultants at quite eye-watering rates, to be honest, to improve student retention, drive through staff redundancies and restructures, and administer student accommodation, among other roles. Campuses have seen a rash of vanity building projects and cheaply thrown up student accommodation aimed at presenting an image of world-class facilities in the competitive soup that is modern higher education in Britain. Oh, and these principals and top managers and vice chancellors, who increasingly see themselves as chief executive officers and managing directors, pay themselves very large remunerations commensurate with private industry rates. What's been happening at the sharp end? Staff and students have been massively impacted by this class assault, especially those from disadvantaged groups. For example, in 2019, UCU, the University and College Union, in the preamble to the union's Mind the Gap campaign, found that the gender pay gap was stubbornly sticking at around a bit over 15%. In UCU's recent statement in response to the really dreadful and retrograde Sewell report that came out a couple of weeks ago, the union pointed out that HE institutions are very much part of the problem of institutional racism, as reflected in recruitment, retention, and advancement of BME staff across the board. Fewer than 1% of the professors employed at UK universities are black, and few British universities employ more than 1 or 2 black professors. Only 140 academic staff at professional level are identified as black, at professorial level, sorry, identified as black, equating to 0.7% out of a total of more than 21,000 professors. These are from HESA figures in 2018-2019. I can go on. Disabled staff report managerial reluctance to recruit disabled people or make effective reasonable adjustments once people are in-house. LGBT plus staff still experience homophobia and transphobia in very significant ways in HE institutions, even where good LGBT plus policies might exist on paper. The 2016 study by UCU, NUS and other organisations showed that something like 51% of lesbian and gay students and 59% of non-binary students experience homophobic and transphobic bullying, and 17% of staff respondents experienced name calling, at work. This is trans students and staff in particular are often in the front line. Trans students suffer disproportionate dropout rates, and staff and students report significantly higher rates of harassment and bullying than even LGB staff and students. What's the context of all this? Staff, teaching and non-teaching staff, have faced wave after wave of attacks on working conditions, pay, pensions and workloads in recent decades. A new assault on the USS pension in HE is looming. Pay for teaching staff is estimated to have fallen in real terms by around 20% over the last 20 years or so. And then there are the contracts themselves. I've been, I suppose, lucky in my own educational experiences. I was one of those who benefited from the huge expansion of HE in the 1960s onwards, the first time that significant numbers of working class school students had access to university places, funded by local authority payment of fees and maintenance grants. I worked before I went to university, and the grant and dependence allowance gave my young family at the time roughly the same disposal income as my admittedly rather poorly paid job had done previously. Some people like me became the first from our families from council estates, mostly grammar school educated, to get to university. Capitalism at that time needed an expanded workforce in professional, managerial and technical roles and in the public sector. And to fill that, they needed many more women who joined the workforce, more working class students, and further and higher education expanded, really significantly at that time. Some of you, I don't know if you've come across this, any sociologists might have done, I suppose. In 1967, the sociologist John Goldthorpe came up with the embourgeoisement thesis, the idea that workers, through growing access to car ownership, house ownership, and so on, were effectively entering the middle class and would lose their class consciousness. Yet far from embourgeoisement happening, in practice, what we've witnessed from the 1980s on has been a relentless process of proletarianization in further and higher education. Teachers and lecturers pushed down into the broader working class, increasingly becoming less like self-directing professionals and more like hired hands, closely micromanaged, poorly paid for the hours worked, treated as disposable, subject to regular scrutiny in relation to discipline, accountability to student ratings, pass and retention rates, and target attention for attainment through the REF and so on. Finally, as Barbara mentioned, there's been the pandemic. Working from home in the pandemic has actually made this whole situation worse in all sorts of ways. Even before the second wave, we were seeing another huge attack on higher education, pensions and jobs, and even threats of fire and rehire on worse conditions being contemplated by management, such as currently in Scottish colleges, which has provoked strike action by members of the Education Institute of Scotland. Thankfully, by the way, their escalating strike action has actually delivered a victory in the last couple of days. Not that the fire and rehire tactic is completely new. For 3 years in the late 1990s, our NAPFI branch at Bradford College resisted ultimatums for staff to sign up to new, worse contracts on pain of being sacked if we didn't. It took us years of non-compliance and 8 days of strike action, but eventually we got a new contract, the best in our region, if not the whole country, not too different from the old National Silver Book contract that had been universally dumped by the employers when incorporation happened. Coming back to today and rounding up, really, there's resistance by staff and students to what's going on in HE, often using traditional working class methods to fight back. For example, on various campuses right now, students are holding rent strikes and occupations against universities charging rent despite their not being able to be in the accommodation during the pandemic. And some of these have been successful already. A number of UCU branches supported by students have also balloted for strike action against proposed redundancies. And again, some of these threats have been withdrawn. At Leeds University recently, staff unions and students campaigned together against the senior management attempt to introduce a new and detrimental trans policy, forcing its withdrawal. So from my perspective, as a trade union and an LGBT+ activist, while staff and students, especially working class staff and students and those in vulnerable groups, face a variety of threats and stresses, we shouldn't be gloomy or pessimistic about what collective resistance can achieve in the defence of access to higher education and decent conditions, as well as democratic, universal and progressive educational ideals. HE staff, teaching and non-teaching, and students need to have both a vision of a better education system and a sense of hope that this is achievable. The most vulnerable staff and students in our institutions need to be protected from the current onslaught, and the shocking levels of precarity in higher education have to be actively and collectively challenged and not just documented. I'll finish with a quote from Andrew McGettigan's book, and he says this: "Any worthwhile alternative also involves a longer range struggle, one that makes the case and fights for mass higher education, not as value for money, but as a quality commitment to the population defined as whoever can benefit." And I'll finish there and pass on. Thanks very much for listening.
Many thanks, Laura. That was fantastic. So I'll hand over now to our final speaker, Teresa.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much to both Barbara and Laura for that. It's such a great introduction to what I'm going to discuss next. So what I'm going to discuss is focuses on the research I did with 89 self-defined working class academics, and also just my everyday interactions with students. It was actually students who inspired me to write my book, because when I would interact with students, I used to get a pretty similar comment over and over, that I was approachable or that I was normal. And when I actually, I started to, as a sociologist, started to look at, okay, what do they mean by that? Did they mean, is it in relation to gender? But the more and more I unpicked what they would say, I realised it was due to social class. Because when I spoke to other working class male academics, they had some similar experiences as well. So it's important to state that right from the start that working class students in particular are often seen as in deficit. Barbara mentioned this already, whereas actually, in fact, they bring to higher education immense cultural wealth, capital and assets. I will have to really summarise this very, very quickly. Whereas when we think about working class academics, even the title of being called a working class academic is sometimes we're not even allowed to be called a working class academic. The amount of times that when I presented about this topic, the focus has been on how can I, so I call myself a working class academic, how can I define myself as a working class academic? And the reason being is that there's assumption you can't be working class and an academic. And it's this idea that once you become an academic, you leave your working class heritage behind. Now, I'm 48. I've been an academic for about 13 to 15 years. So that is only 13 years of my life that has been influenced by academia. Prior to that, I've lived a normal, happy, normal life. And what's happened is that all those influences have influenced how I am today. So in terms of students, when I talked about, I mentioned that they're not in deficit. Working class students bring immense cultural wealth and assets. So for instance, one of the main things that I would actually suggest is working class students actually come to higher education, and they've had to overcome many barriers to get here. So this is not to say that a student who's not from a working class background has not had barriers, but the barriers are more immense when you're actually from a working class background. So this idea that students have actually, they have an aspirational capital. So they've actually dreamt of possibilities that are actually beyond the present circumstances. And the fact that they've even got into university really does show the measure of them. They've not had the means to actually obtain those goals. Also, students and staff, particularly from the humanities, have lived experiences of issues such as poverty, homelessness, unemployment. These funds of knowledge are vital, because it actually, when you're writing about a subject, when you're teaching a subject, and you have those funds of knowledge, if you've unfortunately been affected by homelessness, by unemployment, by poverty, which is disproportionately something that's going to affect people from working class backgrounds, this is what you can actually bring into your writing. You have a deeper knowledge of the issue. So for instance, I remember my students saying to me, Teresa, when you talk about poverty, I know that you've lived that. When other academics talk about poverty, they're just citing statistics. And that's just, in a nutshell, the difference there. And that was what many, many of my respondents talked about. As well as this, it's important to know that often, and I'm not trying to talk myself out of a job here, but universities are not the only repository of knowledge. We can actually gain knowledge from households as well. So I talked about funds of knowledge before. Students come into higher education, and also working class academics bring funds of knowledge. So an example is, family stories, for instance, about the miners' strike. This is lived history, and this is actually a research approach to actually, write history from a lived experience. So the idea that students and staff members who are working class are in deficit, I thoroughly do reject that proposal, which unfortunately permeates the literature, and it permeates, unfortunately, the way universities think about working class students and at times working class academics. At times, as a working class academic, you're meant to feel grateful that you've actually been able to gain a job, whereas actually some of the hoops that you've had to jump to get there means you're actually much more qualified than people who are not from that background. As well, just the idea of actually manoeuvring an institution that has not been made with you in mind. Think about universities, they are elite institutions. Despite widening participation, despite the fact that we have working class academics and working class students, they are not made with you in mind. So the very fact that you've been able to manoeuvre around university, if you get through your first year, you've done a fantastic thing to be able to do that. So in terms of staff, so when I say staff, I mainly mean that the work that I did was mainly with working class lecturers, but also professional staff as well. What I heard over and over again was that staff are approachable due to their background, much more down to earth, and it meant that because of that, students will often feel comfortable approaching them. And this, as I say, where my book came from, the fact that I have lots of students who will come to me during my classes, they'll feel much more comfortable talking to me about an issue than they might perhaps somebody else. And this is not just about gender, as I say, this is about social background. So when I spoke to working class academics, they talked about how they helped students into university. So they did that a variety of different ways. They would actually, before the student had actually gotten to university, they would be supporting them by writing personal statements, by just letting them know what university was like, just educating them as in what university is like, because often they've not had those sort of experiences. If you are the first in your family to go to university, what experience do you have to draw upon? And I think this is where universities really need to be mindful of this. So if a student doesn't know the latest Harvard referencing, if a student doesn't know a structure of an essay, this is not because they're in deficit. They've never been actually immersed in this culture before. It's really important to remember that. I should say, this is not to say all working class academics, because what is so important to remind is that obviously intersectionality comes into this. I don't have the scope to cover that today, but intersectionality means that, you know, different people have different experiences based on other intersections of their identity. So when I spoke to working class academics with a disability, they did, I think it was Barbara that mentioned about the working class academics with a disability had even more hoops to overcome, because little things like being placed in teaching rooms that were in like floor 3 without a lift, things like this really do happen. As well as this, university staff, once the students are in higher education, the people that I spoke to talked about helping students foster a sense of belonging, because it's not enough just to get into university. You need to feel that you fit in. I remember for the first year and a half of being in university, I was waiting for somebody to tap me on the shoulder and ask me to leave. And that feeling when you're already trying to actually get through your exams, you're trying to get through the lecture material, and you really feel that you shouldn't be here. This is not imposter syndrome, it's because the institution is not made for you. As well as this, the academics I spoke to would often bring speakers in from a variety of different backgrounds, and this is what's so important. This is why I thought this event was really useful, to actually have speakers from different backgrounds and actually focus on social class. Considering our country is obsessed with class, we do not like to talk about it in these sorts of ways, and this is why this event is so important. As well as this, I found when I spoke to the lecturers that they often had a teaching approach that really encompassed social justice. They engaged with students from a strengths-based perspective. So they didn't see what students lacked. They engaged with them from a very much a strengths-based perspective. As well as this, they used methods. So when they were teaching, it was very much about co-production. So they would design research projects that would help the local community and things like that. So some of the areas that working class academics actually bring to academia, I feel that other academics could really learn from working class academics rather than the opposite way. Now, I wanted to end on how could we actually help both students and staff, because often we talk about the issue, but we don't really come up with some solutions. So obviously in this very short presentation, I'm just going to give a few solutions here. So how to help students. The first one, I cannot stress enough how important this is. Be approachable and be available. And I need to add to that onto a caveat. Please make sure it's not just one person doing that, because unfortunately in my institution, as lovely as my colleagues are, I am that person. And it gets to the point where you can't help everyone. So we all need to start being more approachable and available to our students. We don't have to have that professional distance. We've earned our stripes to actually be in a higher education institution by virtue of passing our degrees and things like that. We don't have to have this snootiness with the way that we interact with students. And unfortunately, I see it over and over again. My colleagues are thoroughly lovely people, but they have a snootiness with when they actually engage with students, and that really needs to end. As well as this, we need to be mindful about the time constraints that people from a working class background have. Now, obviously, I know that many students will need to work to supplement their studies, but often people from a working class background don't have the bank of mum and dad to actually help them. They do not have any extra funds. So we need to be very mindful about these. So when we actually set up events, be mindful that people can't attend. So this is where it's useful just to record these events. As well as this, we need to make sure we provide internships, and not just unpaid, unpaid internships, paid internships, and also any other paid opportunities, and not just for the summer, but throughout the year, so everybody can take part. What I find strange about a university at times is that we are built on the idea that, you know, education is going to be the way that can help you develop in life, but there are so many barriers for our working class students, and we need to help and support them as much as possible. Now, in terms of how do we, and this is how I'm going to finish now, how do we actually support working class academics? But this is actually not just about supporting working class academics, it's making the rest of higher education, I believe, wake up. One of the nicest comments I received on my book, it's actually on the front cover, is that every Vice Chancellor needs to read this book. And of course, I am going to say that, you know, it would be nice if they did. But from a personal level, it is important that Vice Chancellors, not just the people on the ground every day who work with students, but the Vice Chancellors need to know things like this. We need to recognise class inequalities. We need to stop making assumptions about intelligence, professionalism, little things like the fact that I have gone for coffees with students and I will have a laugh and a joke with students. At times it can be suggested there's a lack of professionalism. I need to actually plug in my computer. I'm just going to be two seconds out. It's done. Oh, panic then. It said it's going to turn off. But just little things, that the fact that I've actually gone for coffee with my students, this is still very professional, but you can still have a coffee with a student, a group of students before a lecture, and it does not mean that you're not professional. So let's stop making assumptions about professionalism. Let's stop making assumptions about one's attire, the language that's used, communication style. If, for instance, a student wants to watch a documentary on serial killers, does that really matter? And also, be mindful of some of the discussions that we have, particularly in the elite institutions, about housing, dinner, vacations. Some of our students do not have access to the funds to actually go on vacation. Obviously, that's not none of us have access to vacations at the moment. As well as this, we need to challenge these stereotypes about working class communities. If we think about working class communities, how they're portrayed on TV, in the media, again, it's always in deficit, the chav, all these like ways that working class communities are portrayed. We need to look at working class communities in a totally different way. So one way that you could do this is, if you are teaching, do you challenge class diversity in your module? Or do you, unfortunately, like some modules I've come across, have one session for each module that says class and crime? And basically, when you're talking about class and crime, you're talking about the crime that working class people commit. Let's have a bit more diversity in how we talk about working class people. Do you unintentionally, because even with the best of intentions, you can unintentionally perpetuate the myth that there are no class distinctions? There are class distinctions. I notice class distinctions every day in my work experience, and I work with wonderful colleagues, but every day there are class distinctions. Little things like I'm on the executive board in my school, and there are class distinctions from the things that they are able to do, the houses that they buy, the houses that I'm not able to buy. There are class distinctions. I wanted as much as I could to talk to bring intersectionality into this, but what I would actually say is it's very important to not just show solidarity to our working class students and academics, but also people who have disabilities, LGBT communities, also BME staff, because we know overwhelmingly, Laura talked very eloquently about the statistics regarding staff, and it's those staff that tend to be left out in academia. We need to make sure academia is a broad church and it's not just the same old people, because if we have the same old people, we get the same old knowledge. Also, remember that students bring knowledge to you. You are not the font of all knowledge. Students bring knowledge to you, and you can learn an awful lot from students. And finally, remember the capital that you bring to academia. So what do you bring to academia? Rather than think of what you're lacking, that you may not find it easier to write an essay, or you may find it difficult actually applying for funding. What are the advantages that you bring to higher education? It's important to remember that. What are your funds of knowledge? And thank you very much for inviting me. I really think this is such an important event. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks to all our speakers on the panel. I thought that was fantastic, and we covered a lot of ground there. And there was a lot of insight and reflection in those three talks, and I also thought it helped problematize this this discussion and issue of class and how it intersects with other kind of demographics and other dimensions of identity other protected characteristics, but also finishing on Teresa's kind of point about, well, we can problematize it. We shouldn't see someone's kind of social background as necessarily a problem that they are in deficit. I think that was a really positive point to finish on. I've got some questions that I would like to ask, but in the interest of time, I'll move on to some of the questions that have been posted in the chat. So we had Jordan ask the question, and Jordan says, he's based in Ireland, and he says it feels as though the UK are much further ahead in the conversations about being a working class academic and also working class students. And I suppose the crux of his question is there a felt benefit to this in the UK within UK HE as a result, in terms of retention of working class students, presence of working class academics, and so on. I'll open that out to the whole panel. Maybe if you want to start with you, Barbara, if you want to kind of, do you think that we can see the effect of some of these conversations within the UK system of higher education?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that we can see some real sort of successes in the sort of diversifying of the students that come in the doors, and especially at institutions that do have a more diverse workforce in terms of social class background. I'm not sure of actual figures, but I think there's a definite correlation. And I think again here the pre-92 Russell Group universities, they have the most to catch up on here. I think as Teresa and Laura said, there's we can't sort of just treat the university system here in the UK as like all the same. There's obviously very different institutions, and some really buy into the sort of extra support structures that are needed for students than others, and also I would say have greater success in actually sort of following up on principles of diversifying the workforce than others, and I think I'm sure there must be a correlation. I'm wondering if Teresa and Laura have like particular study they can link to there, but I think definitely we've seen all through education, even from the primary sector on, that that if people can see more educators that are people like them, then that does definitely have an impact on how they feel in terms of belonging and feeling that they can succeed, whether it's in at school or in college or university as well. So absolutely.
Yeah, and maybe kind of direct that to Laura and Teresa as well, because when you're speaking then, Barbara, I think there is a bit of a puzzle, or there's a paradox, isn't there, in that, and you know, the way that higher education was certainly preached to me, not a great deal, but while I was in school, was that, you know, as well as opening up doors, it expands your horizons, and it gives, you know, it opens up new experiences, and you meet different type of people. So the fact that students also need to see people like them, or that they can recognize, that those two things seem to run almost counter to each other, or that they're certainly not the same. So, you know, is university about belonging, or is it about challenging you and opening up to new experiences? And can those two things be reconciled easily? Maybe ask that to Laura or Teresa. I'll leave it if you want to jump in.
Shall I jump in first?
Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
I mean, the question asked if there is, I think, if there's information about this, or possible, you know, research that people can be pointed towards, and I don't know the answer. I mean, it may be that Teresa or Barbara know better than me on this. I've not been teaching much really for 5 years, so and I'm kind of, you know, I'm out of the loop in that respect. But I do endorse what you've just said and what others have just said about, you know, about availability, about accessibility, about seeing people, you know, who share similar backgrounds to your students. I mean, somebody else, I think it was Lucy Harding, pointed out in the chat the levels of elitism that exist between institutions of kind of further and higher education. I mean, you've got your FE colleges, you've got your post 92s, then your pre 92s, and then your Russell group, at the top. And I know from just a union perspective, there were difficulties when our two unions. I was originally in the Further Education Union, NATFE, and we merged with the Association of Teachers, which was the higher education, the union. And there were some difficulties because, not to be, well, to be frank, I think a lot of us from a working class FE background were treated as oiks. We were regarded as not really proper academics. We were very, we were little more than demonstrators almost, and I think there's probably some element of that probably persists where where we're discounted, I think, in some ways. But in terms of I think it was what Teresa was saying about the importance of how you relate to students from working class background is absolutely true. We were, as I said in my talk, we were very clear about having a very robust pastoral care system with our students who were overwhelmingly working class. And for a long time, I've kind of finished on this. I was the admissions tutor and then the tutor for a course in counselling and psychology. And I always erred on the side of leniency, if you like, in terms of encouraging people to join the course and be part of it and give them confidence to do that, because often they did turn up at the interview feeling that they weren't really supposed to be there somehow, that it was kind of odd for them to be wanting to go into higher education, and a lot of it was about giving people confidence to understand and accept that they could make a success and that it would open all sorts of doors for them potentially. So I'm rambling, so I'll shut up there, but I think that's really, really important.
I'd say, so in terms of Ireland, what I did notice, I spoke to 89 academics, and the vast majority, I think off the top of my head, was 62 were from England. So I didn't feel comfortable enough in my book to actually focus on specific differences in terms of England, Ireland, Wales, Scotland. But I did notice that, and this is other interviews I've done as well, is that in Ireland, I noticed the two very elite institutions there, they seem to need a lot more work in terms of the respondents I spoke to. And as well as this, but the post-1992 institutions in Ireland and across the UK, and also the traditional institutions, they are the ones that seem to be doing the most work. Like, for instance, you found when the TEF, the Teaching Excellence Framework, first came out, it was the post-1992s and the traditional institutions, like Bangor, for instance, got a gold, and it was all the higher institutions that didn't. So I do have some data on that, but I don't really think I've put enough about that in my book, because it was about the sheer numbers, and I needed to investigate that further. But I feel that Ireland is, in terms of the post-1992s, are doing very, very well, because often they hire people who've been doing the PhD, and then it's this, so they've done the PhD, then they carry on as a lecturer, which that's exactly what happened to me in my institution. I would just point out the comments I've seen regarding accent. That is one of a huge theme in the research over and over. A respondent talked about how she got a new job and she was told you're basically going to have to get rid of that Welsh accent if students are going to understand you. Another one was told she gave a presentation and somebody said, I can't understand you because you're talking in a regional manner. And then she told her supervisor, and he said, well, basically, can you change the way you talk? So there are definitely issues regarding accent, unfortunately. So yes.
I can't actually relate to that one, Teresa, because I haven't really got much of an accent myself. So at that point, no. But I think there's an interesting point here about Cecilia's made a note, and Ian's responded to it in the chat about, and it's probably one of the reasons I suggested this event, was that within the debate around equality, diversity, and inclusion, because class is not currently a protected characteristic, it's often left out, or it's often seen to be kind of difficult to kind of bring into that conversation, or at least official policies, if not conversations. And Cecilia's asked kind of how can we move this on, given it hasn't got this legal definition, at least something, and this is purely personal, purely anecdotal. I think one of the big differences between class and the other protected characteristics is that it's framed as if students, or indeed, you know, academics enter academia as either staff or students, they've done well, and then there's an assumption that they will then assimilate into that particular way of life, and you abandon everything else. So, and that's partly structural, because if you're an academic, generally you will have to move from from where you live and your family background, and be somewhere else and live a particular, let's say, typical academic lifestyle. And I think to a lesser extent the same for students, but that may be less the case now. So how can we? It's all well and good talking about these things, I suppose, from a kind of official policy point of view. How can this be moved on? And I'll put this to Barbara first, because I know, Barbara, you need to leave shortly. So.
Yes, and yeah, apologies everyone. I've got another another thing meeting I need to present at 11, so I will have to go a little bit before this. But yeah, absolutely. I think that totally it resonates with me, Danny. And I'm seeing, for example, the comments, the discussion about imposter syndrome, and that I really like the idea of the imposter syndrome, the variant there. But it makes me sort of think of the key thing that we need to make sure universities focus on is that we shouldn't be trying to get students or staff to assimilate into an established academic culture, but we need to be changing academic culture. You know, whether it's things like just off the top of my head, a lot of early career academics find the question and answer sessions in conference talks, for example, to be very intimidating, because they can be quite adversarial. And do we have to continue with those things? And again, the ways of talking in seminar groups, for example, it favours people who already feel confident and that they feel like they belong at university. Do we have to keep with these established ways of doing things, or can we find more collegiate, supportive ways to have discussions that don't involve the potential for people to to feel like, oh my god, I wish I hadn't said that, or I've got this all wrong, and so on. Again, it's questioning the practices that we do, rather than trying to change people to fit into what has this culture that has been around for 100 years or so, and really needs to change. Yeah.
Thanks, Barbara. Teresa, did you want to, or Laura, did you want to come in on that theme?
I was going to say, class needs to be added to the Equality Act. As in that's one way. So in Wales, we do have the socio-economic duty that is enacted in Wales, and I think this is something that I noticed. So I'm originally English, but I've lived in Wales for a long time, and when I go to conferences, I notice that it's always the English context that's focused on. So very few people would know, unless they look at this area, that in Wales, the socio-economic duty, it has actually been enacted. And I think that England needs to follow the lead there. It was going to be, but Theresa May put the kibosh on that because, well, they're not going to want to do that at all. The other area as well, which is much more difficult, believe it or not, is that working class people need to, I'm not saying that you shouldn't try and pass as middle class, but if there's a class issue, we must speak out. So, for instance, when I talk about in my institution, I'm a pastoral care lead, and I talk about how students will often come to me and other females. But what I'm trying to get up the nerve to say is that they actually come to me due to my working class background. I haven't quite got the nerve to say that yet, but I'm getting there, because it's opened up a whole can of worms that I don't really need I don't really need. But that is actually, it's not just gender, why students go to academics. It's also working class men that they go to, and they're the people that often get left behind in this discussion. So there are two areas that, you know, people need to speak up about this, whether it's, and, you know, as in, if your supervisor is actually talking to you about our accent, challenge them, because, you know, that's the one thing I've learned. I'm a supervisor now, a PhD supervisor, and I would expect my students to challenge me, you know, as in, I don't want them just to listen to what I'm saying, I want them to challenge what I would say as well. So they're just two ways, you know. The first one, you know, we've got to rely on government to do that, and then the second one, we need to basically be loud and proud in the institution.
Laura, do you have anything to add?
Well, not a lot, because I think Teresa summed it up really, really well. I mean, it's about staff developing, you know, the sort of individual and collective confidence to challenge what actually, you know, it amounts to an institutional elitism, which is very deeply embedded. You know, as you know, all the indicators are there, aren't they? And the history of higher education, the history of the university system, and so on. I mean, you know, it's not something that can be changed overnight. Unfortunately, it's a bit like, you know, the whole process of, you know, decolonizing the curriculum, isn't it? It's a process that can be begun and pursued, and it will be easier to pursue and develop that sort of process the more that staff, as I see it, collectively feel empowered to do that. Because it is a question of power. It's also a question of how the institutions are governed. You know, what are the governance structures? Do staff have any real voice in those governing structures? By and large, not much, actually, is the answer to that, and far less so than they used to have. When I first went to Bradford College in teaching HE, you know, we had you know, we decided as a department what degrees we would introduce, what we would continue. We made all those decisions collegiately, you know, and that was wiped out, and it became very hierarchical. So the process has actually been retrograde, frankly, you know, rather than towards more progressive. And I think there has to be a whole fight for democratizing the institutions, you know, recognizing that actually underlying a lot of what we've been saying today, I don't see class as a kind of an also ran, you know, alongside issues of gender and so on and so forth. It's absolutely fundamental, because it's about the economic relationship, isn't it? Class is an economic relationship, and it underpins everything that we do in our educational institutions. And it's a long fight, but actually I think it's one that you know, is absolutely necessary, but will take time.
Thanks, Laura. I know, Barbara, you need to leave now, so I'll allow you to leave at this point. We've got a few minutes left, and there's a number of different questions and comments. Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Thanks again. Speak to you soon. There's a number of different comments and questions in the chat. We haven't got time to cover them all at this stage. Maybe if I just give the last couple of minutes, people an opportunity, perhaps to turn their mics on and ask a question or two that they feel hasn't been covered so far. If people feel able to do that, if you can raise your hand, and then I'll select people who've raised a hand, and then you can ask their questions. Cecilia, yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. Hi, Laura. It was really something that you were saying at the beginning in your presentation, and it's to do with sessional lecturers. Now, I'm a part-time sessional lecturer. I get paid hourly for the actual lecture. And because of that, I'm on government top-up benefits, etc., as a single parent and all that. Now, they're reviewing this across the university because they realise it's quite an unfair practice. So they want to introduce, you get paid an additional couple of hours for every hour you work for preparation and meetings. However, the cost of that, you know, paying 3 times the salary instead of once, if you see what I mean. My fear is they will cut even more sessional staff, because that will just become too expensive to employ sessional staff. So whilst economically it would be great, I feel it's going to even lower the hours given to sessional staff. What are perhaps your comments on that, or your feelings towards that sort of level of precarity? Thank you.
Yeah, Yes, Cecilia, that is a it's a danger of trade-off, isn't it? I mean, the answer has to be, well, it's a glib answer, but I mean, it has to be about having a contract, I think, a national contract, or at the very least, an institutional contract that builds in. I mean, agreed, you know, with the relevant unions, agreed contract that it builds in prep time and so on. And we used to have that, you know, under our FE regulations. We used to have that where I forget what the proportion was, but if you were a sessional, you know, hourly paid, you also got a consideration in relation of preparation and marking time, and that disappeared, you know, and I think pretty generally has disappeared, as you pointed out, and of course it's manifestly unfair because you can spend 3 times you know, the time preparing and marking as delivering. It's very easy, if you're thorough, it's very easy to spend enormous amounts of time doing that. The glib answer is it has to be something that has to be built into, you know, the institutional contract, you know, negotiation between the union, in my view, as a trade unionist, between the union and the management. There's no simple answer because unscrupulous institutions are potentially going to do that, and in the process rack up the workload for those who remain. It's a horrible situation.
Thanks, Laura.
Unmute myself. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Cecilia, for your question. People have helpfully been posting in the chat about, for those who don't know, and it's something that I'm going to look to engage with in the future, about the Working Class Academics Association. I think, Teresa, you're organised, or you're involved in this. Yeah. And they run an annual conference as well.
Yeah, so there's two different, there's the Association of Working Class Academics, and I was involved in that right from the start, but it actually hit just when I was writing my books, so I had to not leave that. There was no acrimony or anything, but I attended the Working Class Academics Conference, and I attended it to talk about my research, which obviously you do. But I have to say, it has been the most supportive environment I've ever presented research at. So I'm actually one of the chairs for this year, and I know we've already like divvied up the, you know, the presentations. I think it's close. If anybody wanted to submit, it would be worth contacting Peter Shuki, and you can copy myself in as well, and asking if you could submit to the conference still, or just attend, because I have to say it is the most supportive conference I've been involved with. And actually, Peter Shuki's words, he's got beautiful words in his blog, and I use that to close my book, because basically he talks about how working class is not a problem, and I just really loved those words. It's not a problem to be solved, or an accent to be rounded and things like that. But I would definitely highly recommend the Working Class Academics Conference, without a doubt. And I've just noticed Lisa there. Lisa is absolutely fantastic. So yes, it's highly recommend.
Yeah, I think that's a really good suggestion. I think it relates back, and I'll draw this to a close because we've run over, but it relates back to Barbara's point about the environment and the support that people receive, and how that may be differential, and people may feel uncomfortable in certain situations, or maybe feel disadvantaged in certain situations. And I know, and this does kind of in a roundabout way relate, I think, to my own social background. When I was on a fixed term contract for a number of years at a different institution, I had an interest. My background was in the politics of regulation, and I had an interest in looking at the regulation of sport. And I was told, with best intentions by my supervisor stroke mentor, do not engage with that research until you get a permanent post. And then once you get a permanent post, you can research sport. But I think the underlying message was, if you look at sport, which is marginal and trivial within the kind of the canon on politics, that will compound your existing, you know, perceived kind of working class credentials, and it will marginalize you more. And that kind of continued, and it ended up that, along with another colleagues in different universities looking at the politics of sport, we just developed our own association and began to run our own conference. So you don't have, and I think that again relates back to this assimilation point. If something's not working for you, then you create your own association, or look for like-minded colleagues for that support if you're not receiving it within the kind of the established structures. So again, thanks to Barbara who's now left us, thanks to Laura, thanks to Teresa. I thought they were absolutely wonderful talks, and thanks to everyone who's attended. I think it's been really well engaged with, and really welcome and appreciate the comments and questions that have been provided in this session. I hope everyone has enjoyed it. As I said, it has been recorded, so I will send an email with the recording of this session if people want to watch it back, or as I say, forward it on to other friends and colleagues. And I will include Professor Bhopal's keynote lecture from Tuesday in that same email as well, if people weren't able to attend that earlier in the week. So that's it. Thanks again for everyone for attending, and a special thanks to our speakers today.